The year was 1943, and the air above Germany was not a battlefield. It was a charnel house. It was a place where young American men, encased in thin aluminum shells called B-17 flying fortresses, were systematically murdered at 25,000 feet. We remember the names: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Kassel. They were not strategic successes. They were bloodbaths, monuments to technological arrogance and strategic failure. On that fateful day in October 1943, 60 bombers, 600 airmen, vanished from the sky over Schweinfurt in a single afternoon. The men who returned were hollow-eyed specters, clinging to the realization that deep penetration meant certain death. The German defense, honed to a razor edge, knew precisely where the Escort fighters, the short-legged P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, had to turn back, leaving the bombers isolated, floating targets for the deadly efficiency of the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The 8th Air Force was dying, not by being shot down piecemeal, but by the sheer, unsustainable attrition of its high command's hubris. They were winning the battle of bombs, perhaps, but they were decisively losing the battle of nerves and, most critically, the battle of strategic air superiority. Morale was plummeting to dangerous lows. The odds of completing the required 25 missions seemed less like a challenge and more like a cruel mathematical impossibility. This existential crisis, this desperate need to either conquer the skies or abandon the daylight bombing campaign entirely, led directly to the creation of what became known simply as the Big Week. This was not just another raid. This was the ultimate calculated gamble by Allied High Command, a desperate maneuver designed not merely to hit factories, but to lure the entire operational strength of the German Luftwaffe into a single, decisive, and final battle of attrition. The plan was terrifying in its scope. Hit the crucial fighter assembly plants simultaneously and relentlessly for 7 consecutive days, forcing the Germans to defend these vital targets with everything they had. The goal was to destroy the German fighter force in the air while simultaneously grinding their production capability into dust on the ground dash. To make this possible, one final, crucial piece of hardware had arrived in the UK. A sleek, beautiful, long-range machine that promised to change the arithmetic of survival forever. The North American P-51 Mustang. This aircraft, originally a British request, equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, possessed the speed and, crucially, the range to fly not just to the targets but home again, shadowing the bombers every single agonizing mile. But even with the Mustang, the coming operation, codenamed Argument, was a roll of the dice. If the weather held, if the crews endured, and if the Luftwaffe rose to the challenge, the Allies would either break German air power forever, or they would suffer a defeat so profound that D-Day would be unthinkable. The weight of the entire European war effort rested upon the shoulders of men who had seen too much death, now asked to fly into the deepest heart of the Reich, knowing that this time, there could be no turning back early. The cold, damp air of England in February 1944 hummed with a dread anticipation, the silence of the pre-dawn hours broken only by the churning anxiety of 4,000 young men preparing for the most important flight of their lives. Operation Argument, or the Big Week, was a masterpiece of logistical coordination and strategic brutality. It was planned by General Karl Spaatz and articulated by men like Colonel Don Blakesley, the aggressive and legendary fighter commander who understood that true air superiority was gained not by defense, but by relentless, deep-seeking offense. The targets were selected with surgical precision, the assembly plants that built the core of the Luftwaffe's defensive strength. These were the Focke-Wulf plants at Ostersleben and Tutow, the Messerschmitt factory complexes at Leipzig and Regensburg, and the sprawling facilities at Brunswick. These were the targets that were cranking out the fighter aircraft faster than the Allies could shoot them down. The plan stipulated coordinated attacks by the 8th Air Force operating from England and the 15th Air Force flying up from Italy, creating a pincer movement designed to overwhelm German defenses from multiple directions simultaneously. The German General Staff had correctly identified that the Allies needed to destroy fighter production before the invasion, but they underestimated the resolve and the sheer scale of the coming onslaught. They believed the weather would continue to protect them, and initially it did. For days, the vast armada of bombers sat grounded, muffled in the thick, oppressive fog that characterizes English winter. The strain on the crews was enormous. Briefing, waiting, delaying, and then being told to stand down meant that the adrenaline spikes of impending combat were replaced by a corrosive, gnawing uncertainty. Every delay allowed the Luftwaffe precious time to reposition their fighters and repair damaged airfields. But the strategic clock was ticking relentlessly toward June 1944, and the bombing campaign had to achieve dominance before the invasion could even be considered. Spatz was under immense pressure to launch, arguing that even moderately acceptable weather was better than allowing the Germans time to disperse their production entirely. Finally, on the morning of February 20th, 1944, the clouds broke just enough. The briefing rooms at bases across East Anglia exploded with activity. The targets for the first day were set: Leipzig, Brunswick, and Ostravsleben. Over 1,000 heavy bombers were prepared to launch into the frigid European dawn, a staggering concentration of destructive power unlike anything seen before. The airfields roared to life, the noise of thousands of engines drowning out the shouted commands of the ground crews. The men knew the stakes were higher than ever before. This wasn't just another mission. This was the reckoning. If the American bombers could destroy 75% of German fighter production capacity and simultaneously decimate the elite fighter pilot corps, the Experten, then the skies over Western Europe would finally belong to the Allies. If they failed, the sheer weight of losses would cripple the 8th Air Force, effectively surrendering the daylight hours back to the control of the Reich. The B-17s, laden with fuel and bombs, lumbered slowly down the runways, lifting off into a sky that, for the first time, was filled with the promise of long-range escort, yet still choked with the memory of the unmitigated carnage of 43. The initial journey on February 20th was deceptively quiet, a calm before the apocalypse that only heightened the anxiety in the unheated cockpits of the flying fortresses. Lieutenant John Iron Harris, pilot of the B-17G named the Iron Maiden, felt the familiar, bone-deep ache of the cold as the formation climbed towards 27,000 feet. The air was thin, the oxygen masks hissing, and the landscape below Germany was beginning to resemble a pristine, snow-covered map. They were part of the 91st Bomb Group, tasked with hitting the massive Messerschmitt complex outside Leipzig. Harris had flown missions before where the fighters had hit them relentlessly from the moment they crossed the Dutch coast. But today, there was nothing. The P-51 Escorts, their drop tanks still full, flew tight alongside the main bomber streams, a comforting, silent presence. The deeper they flew, however, the more the silence became oppressive, a heavy shroud of psychological warfare. Where were they? The Luftwaffe was known for its aggressive defense. General Galland, the former fighter ace now running the defense, must have prepared a trap. This vast formation, stretching for miles, was an impossible target to miss. The radio chatter remained professional, but beneath the surface, every crew member felt the pressure mounting. They knew the Germans were conserving their strength, allowing the Mustangs to burn through their limited fuel, waiting for the exact moment the escorts would have to peel away. But this was the strategic twist of Operation Argument. The Mustangs were not planning to leave. They were fully provisioned for the entire deep penetration mission. The sheer complexity of the German defense was their biggest downfall. They had meticulously organized interception zones based on previous, shorter-legged American escort fighters. They simply did not account for the continuous, high-altitude presence of the P-51s powered by the legendary Merlin engine, capable of matching the German fighters blow for blow, even above 30,000 feet. The tension snapped abruptly somewhere near the Harz Mountains. From the eastern horizon, not in scattered groups but in enormous, terrifying packs, they came. Hundreds of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, diving with the ferocity of sharks scenting blood, aimed straight for the massed bomber formations. This was the moment of contact, the point where two mighty air forces collided in a spectacular, lethal ballet of high explosives and machine gun fire. Tracer rounds began etching red lines across the clear blue sky, the unmistakable, sickening thud of flak shell bursts sounding like giant, tearing cloth. The calm was over. The big week had begun with the fury of 1,000 guns. The German strategy was brutal and focused. Break the bomber formation quickly, targeting the lead planes to disrupt the bombing run, and ignore the escorts if possible. They introduced specialized units flying the Sturmbock heavy armored FW-190s armed with massive 30mm cannons, designed to smash through the flying fortress defenses like aerial battering rams. These were not the nimble dogfighters of the early war. These were flying tanks, piloted by the most hardened veterans, men who accepted that their mission was to absorb damage and deliver destruction at almost point-blank range. This meant the air battle over Brunswick became a close-quarters slugging match, a desperate, grinding war of attrition where pilot skill was often secondary to sheer willingness to press the attack. As the first wave of German fighters tore into the bomb boxes, the sky immediately filled with smoke, burning wreckage, and spiraling parachutes. The B-17s, flying wingtip to wingtip, delivered a terrifying torrent of defensive fire from their interlocking 50 caliber guns, turning the space between the formations into a maelstrom of metal. The Iron Maiden shuddered violently as a Focke-Wulf clipped the wing of their neighbor, sending the adjacent bomber tumbling out of control in a blossom of fire. Lieutenant Harris fought the controls, struggling to maintain position, the roar of the engines and the incessant hammering of the turret guns a deafening soundtrack to the horror. Yet, the Germans were encountering a new element of resistance that fundamentally changed the geometry of the battle. For the first time, when the Luftwaffe fighters pulled away from their devastating passes, expecting a safe run back to their rearming bases, they were immediately met by P-51s, not in pairs but in squadrons. Colonel Blakesley's dictum was clear. The P-51s were not just bodyguards. They were hunters. They were ordered to stay close until engagement, and then, once the Luftwaffe committed, they were to break off and hunt the German fighters relentlessly until they were forced to land or were destroyed. The Mustang pilots, many of them flying the P-51B and C models for the first time in combat, found themselves engaged in a spectacular high-altitude dogfight, easily matching the speed and climb rate of the German fighters. The Germans were used to the short-fused attacks of the P-47s. They were not used to fighting their way out of a bomber stream only to find the escort fighters now turning the tide and forcing the battle deeper and deeper into the Reich. The loss rates for the German fighters on day one were staggering. While the American bomber losses were still painful, around 21 heavy bombers were destroyed. The Luftwaffe had suffered disproportionate losses to their fighter corps and, crucially, lost many of their irreplaceable Experten dash. The air battle was proving that even with armored Focke-Wulfs, the combined assault of the flying fortresses and the long-range P-51s was simply too powerful to overcome. The Germans had risen to the bait, and the trap had sprung. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang in force during Operation Argument fundamentally redefined air combat over Europe, turning a defensive struggle for bomber survival into an offensive hunt for Luftwaffe destruction. Major Pete Johnson, an ace from the 4th Fighter Group, felt the subtle vibration of the mighty Merlin engine as he danced his P-51D through the shattered remains of a German fighter formation high above Brunswick. His mission was no longer merely to shepherd the B-17s. His mission, and the mission of every Mustang pilot, was to break the back of the German Air Force, regardless of where they found them. The orders from Blakesley had evolved past simple escort duty into a campaign of relentless destruction. If the German pilots broke away, follow them down, harass their airfields, and destroy them before they could rearm and refuel. This doctrine of aggressive pursuit was what truly set the Big Week apart. It was a calculated expenditure of fuel and risk designed to inflict irreversible damage on the enemy's most precious resource: trained pilots. The technological advantage of the P-51, capable of flying from England to Berlin and back with combat allowance, neutralized the geographical defenses the Germans had relied upon for years. The psychological impact on the German pilots was immediate and devastating. They were accustomed to seeing their American opposition run out of gas at the line of demarcation. Now, they were never safe, not even during their landing pattern. Johnson recalled one specific engagement where a flight of Bf-109s, having expended their ammunition against a B-17 box, turned for home, dropping quickly to lower altitudes for protection. Johnson and his wingman dove after them, the speed of the Mustang allowing them to catch the reeling Germans just as they were preparing to land at an auxiliary field outside Magdeburg. He watched, almost clinically, as the airfield erupted in chaos, machine guns blazing as he strafed the incoming aircraft, forcing them to crash land or be blown out of the sky. This was the attrition equation at work. For every bomber lost by the Allies, the Germans were losing multiple irreplaceable, highly trained fighter pilots. The Americans could replace men and machines, The Luftwaffe had run out of time to train the high-caliber pilots needed to fly complex, high-performance aircraft in a high-intensity combat zone. The strategic goal of Operation Argument was achieved not just by bombs on assembly lines, but by the systematic eradication of the human element in the German air defense. The P-51 was the scalpel, and the doctrine of deep hunting was the cutting edge that inflicted the mortal wound. Yet, this intense, high-stakes attrition came with a profound moral cost. These operations were brutal, resulting in the incineration of young men on both sides, and placing an immense strategic necessity on the continued sacrifice. It was war waged at a terrifying pitch, designed to minimize Allied ground casualties later, but maximizing the air war's destructive tempo now. Considering the context of the larger war, the necessity of D-Day, and the knowledge of what awaited the ground troops if air supremacy was not achieved, was this systematic destruction of the German fighter pilot corps, this high attrition strategy, justified by the strategic outcome? Was there any other way to guarantee the success of the invasion that would ultimately shorten the war? Share your thoughts on this terrible balance between strategic necessity and the cost in human lives below. The battle raged on into its second day, with the skies over Germany continuing to feast on metal and men. Day 3 of the big week dawned under a marginally clear sky, perfect for the continuation of the bloodletting. The target was Leipzig again, hitting the already damaged production facilities, and the bomber groups were ordered to press the attack relentlessly, hoping to maximize the psychological damage and force the Luftwaffe commanders to commit even more reserves. The German High Command, spurred by an infuriated Göring, were now scrambling, desperately trying to comprehend the continuous threat posed by the P-51s. They were fully realizing that they were losing the war of attrition. The American losses remained significant, yet they were sustainable for the Allies. For the Germans, however, the casualties were catastrophic. They were losing pilots, the elite Experten who held the institutional knowledge of dogfighting, at a rate of 2 to 3 times that of their own production capacity. The German replacement pilots were often poorly trained, sometimes with barely 100 hours of flight time, thrust directly into combat against veterans who had seen hundreds of hours of deadly engagement. This disparity in skill became the true killer for the Reich's air defense. The sight of the massive American formations, now escorted for the entire journey, was breaking the will of the less experienced German pilots. Over Leipzig, the Germans launched their biggest defensive effort yet, a desperate measure to repel the attack. This engagement saw the B-17 formation surrounded by a massive furball of fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs mixing with the relentless P-51s, the fighting so close and furious that instances of friendly fire became a tragic reality. Lieutenant Harris of the Iron Maiden remembered the sheer volume of aircraft. He saw one B-17 take a direct hit from an armored Focke-Wulf Sturmbock dash, its wing shearing off instantly, the plane disintegrating mid-air, scattering debris and bodies across the cloud cover. But immediately following the Sturmbock attack, 3 P-51s converged on the German formation, their speed and maneuverability allowing them to carve through the heavy, slow-turning FW-190s. The air filled with the oily smoke of burning aviation fuel and the distinctive smell of ozone. The raids were causing massive physical damage on the ground. Photographs taken during the bombing runs showed factory roofs peeled back like tin cans, assembly lines ruptured, and massive fires burning across the industrial landscape. But the true strategic victory was occurring miles above in the stratosphere. The Americans were not just hitting targets. They were systematically eliminating the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich. The pressure was so intense that German fighter control broke down repeatedly. Pilots were running out of gas and crashing in fields simply because their home airfields were under constant harassment. Day 3 concluded with the heaviest German losses of the war to that point. The Germans had successfully shot down over 40 American heavy bombers, a terrifying number for the crews, but the Luftwaffe lost nearly 150 fighters, many of those pilots irreplaceable veterans. The balance of power was tipping irrevocably. The scale of the strategic attrition had reached the point of no return. The Allies had bled, but the enemy was hemorrhaging its very lifeblood. The pivotal tactical change that guaranteed American air supremacy was fully implemented on Day 4. The decision by Colonel Blakesley and the 8th Fighter Command to aggressively hunt the German fighters wherever they retreated. The bombers were still the main objective for the Germans, but for the Mustang pilots, the B-17s were now bait. Blakesley's order was famously succinct. Your job is to destroy the enemy air force. Ignore the bombers if necessary, and go after the fighters until they are all gone. This instruction liberated the Mustang pilots, allowing them to utilize the P-51's superior range and altitude performance to engage the Luftwaffe on their own terms, often far from the relative safety of the bomber stream. Major Johnson and his squadron, flying high cover, were able to observe the tactics of the German fighter waves. They noted the patterns of retreat, the preferred low-altitude corridors, and the specific airfields where the Germans quickly landed to rearm and refuel. Instead of turning back when the combat zone ended, the Mustangs pressed on, turning the pursuit into relentless harassment that extended deep into German airspace. This offensive doctrine effectively meant that the Germans could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. They had to fight not just to intercept the bombers, but to survive the aggressive, long-range counterattacks of the American escorts. One notable engagement saw Johnson's squadron follow a flight of retreating Focke-Wulfs almost to the edge of the Czech border, catching them as they prepared for landing. The resulting chaos on the German airfield was absolute. Planes trying to land were shot down by the Mustangs. Others were destroyed on the ground as the P-51 swept low, guns blazing, their flexibility allowing them to target both airborne and stationary assets. The ground crews, suddenly transformed into frontline soldiers, scattered for cover, unable to provide the rapid turnaround and repair needed to keep the defense operational. The systemic destruction of German airfields and ground infrastructure became a secondary, but incredibly effective, component of Operation Argument. The German pilots who survived the dogfights high above the Reich now faced the danger of being shot down during their most vulnerable moments. Takeoff and landing. The effect was compounded by the continuous nature of the operation. By day 5, the strain on the remaining German fighter units was immense. They were flying multiple sorties a day, often without adequate rest and watching their comrades, and often their planes, destroyed in waves. The Americans, conversely, rotated fresh crews and aircraft from their secure bases in England. The disparity in resources, both material and human, meant that victory was becoming a mathematical certainty for the Allies. The intensity of the fighting did not wane, but the quality of the German opposition clearly deteriorated. The high-altitude formations of B-17s, though still taking fire, were increasingly able to drop their payloads with less interference, because the aggressive pursuit by the P-51s ensured that the main defense effort had to be diverted away from the bomb run itself. To fully understand the scope of the Big Week, one must appreciate the sheer logistical audacity of the raids on Day 6, targeting the deepest recesses of the German industrial heartland, specifically the manufacturing centers in Austria. The mission to Steyr, nestled deep in the Alpine foothills, was one of the longest and most taxing raids of the entire war. This was territory normally covered exclusively by the 15th Air Force flying up from Italy, but for Operation Argument, the 8th Air Force committed a massive strike force, leveraging the P-51's extreme range capabilities to prove that nowhere in the Reich was truly safe anymore. Lieutenant Harris and the Iron Maiden were assigned to this grueling mission, an 11-hour round trip that pushed the limits of the B-17's endurance and the crew's sanity. Flying over Czechoslovakia and into Austria meant navigating treacherous mountain terrain, dealing with icing at altitude, and facing air defenses that were less concentrated but still fiercely protected by localized flak units. The isolation felt by the crews on this leg of the journey was palpable. They were thousands of miles from the safety of England, flying high above enemy territory that stretched endlessly in all directions. The air was thin, the cold merciless, and the knowledge that rescue, should they be shot down, was virtually impossible weighed heavily on every man. But the commitment had to be made. The Steyr ball-bearing plants and the Wiener Neustadt aircraft assembly factories were critical nodes in the German war machine, and their destruction was essential to crippling production. The German High Command, surprised by the depth of the penetration, struggled to assemble a meaningful defense. The primary fighter reserves had already been depleted defending the Western German industrial centers. The few Me-109s that rose to meet the formation were swiftly dealt with by the accompanying P-51s, who, though flying at the absolute limit of their fuel reserves, still maintained aggressive attack profiles. The air battle over Steyr was less a desperate melee and more a systematic destruction run. The American bombers delivered their payloads accurately, reducing acres of crucial industrial buildings to smoke and rubble. More importantly, the ability of the Allies to project fighter power this deep into the Reich confirmed to the Germans that their entire defensive strategy was obsolete. There was no safe zone left. Every factory, every airfield, every city was now vulnerable to continuous, high-altitude, escorted precision bombing. The success of the Steyr raid wasn't just about the ball bearings destroyed. It was about the confirmation of total vulnerability. The long flight home was an exercise in pure willpower. The crews nursed their damaged aircraft, flying through increasingly heavy weather, their fuel gauges dipping dangerously low. But they had achieved what seemed impossible just months earlier. They had flown the entire distance, destroyed a primary target, and returned, all under the protective shield of continuous fighter escort. The strategic map of the European air war had been rewritten in a single grueling day. The final days of Operation Argument were less about spectacular dogfights and more about grinding down the German will to resist. The Luftwaffe, having suffered catastrophic losses of both veteran pilots and irreplaceable aircraft, attempted to conserve its remaining strength by withdrawing large formations from combat, opting instead for smaller, more decentralized attacks against the bomber streams. But the damage had been done. The systematic destruction of fighter production capacity, coupled with the annihilation of the veteran pilot corps, meant that even if the Germans could quickly rebuild their factories, they would lack the trained personnel to fly the planes. This was the true, irreversible casualty of the Big Week. The total tally across the 7 main days of continuous operations was staggering. Allied losses were high, emphasizing the brutal nature of the campaign. Approximately 226 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, were lost, along with around 30 American escort fighters. This represented a substantial, painful cost to the 8th Air Force. However, the German losses were catastrophic and strategic. The Luftwaffe lost over 350 fighters confirmed destroyed in the air, with hundreds more damaged beyond immediate repair on the ground or during crash landings. Crucially, the number of pilots killed or captured exceeded 500, with a significantly higher percentage of those being the irreplaceable Experten, the backbone of the German defense. These figures meant that the German fighter force was effectively broken as an organized, high-altitude defensive unit. The psychological shift back in England was immediate and profound. Lieutenant Harris recalled the difference in the briefing rooms after the Big Week. Before, the air was thick with fatalism and dread. Now, while seriousness remained, there was a palpable feeling of cautious optimism, even relief. The crews knew the skies were still dangerous, but the overwhelming, systematic carnage of 1943 had lifted. The heavy, armored Sturmbock formations, designed to terrorize the B-17s, were now rarely encountered. The sight of the P-51s, now present from takeoff to landing, gave the bomber crews a confidence they had never possessed before. The Luftwaffe, still capable of defensive actions, could no longer mount the cohesive, relentless intercepts that threatened the existence of the daylight bombing campaign. They had been forced to scatter, to hide, and to conserve strength. The initiative had passed entirely to the Allies, and the implications for the forthcoming invasion of Europe were nothing short of monumental. The sacrifice of Big Week had not just secured air superiority. It had secured air dominance, a prerequisite for the success of Operation Overlord. The strategic outcome of Operation Argument was not merely a reduction in enemy fighter capability. It was the establishment of total, unambiguous air supremacy over Western Europe. This dominance was the single most critical factor guaranteeing the success of the Normandy invasion later that year. Without the results of the Big Week, the planning for D-Day would have been fundamentally flawed, perhaps even fatally impossible. Imagine the landing beaches on June 6, 1944, if the Luftwaffe had retained its 1943 strength. Waves of German fighters and bombers would have decimated the landing craft, rendered Allied air cover useless, and pulverized the invasion forces struggling to establish a foothold. Instead, thanks to the sacrifices made during those intense 7 days in February, the skies over Normandy were almost entirely silent of German aircraft. The Allied forces landing on the beaches fought the German army, but they rarely fought the German Air Force. The air umbrella provided by the now dominant American and British fighters and bombers was absolute, allowing Allied ground forces to operate with near impunity from aerial attack and ensuring that German troop movements were constantly hampered by continuous bombing and strafing runs. The true legacy of the Big Week lies in this transition. It transitioned the air war from a grueling slugfest of attrition, where Allied survival was always in doubt, to a strategic campaign of domination, where Allied air forces dictated the terms, location, and intensity of combat. The P-51 Mustang had achieved its full potential, not just as an escort fighter, but as a strategic weapon designed to hunt and destroy the enemy's air force at its roots. The destruction of German aircraft factories, particularly the facilities building single-engine fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190, crippled the German ability to replace losses in the short term. But the decisive blow was the systematic elimination of the veteran pilot corps, a human resource that Germany, unlike the industrialized might of the United States, simply could not replenish in time to save the Reich. From February 1944 onward, the air war in Europe became a one-sided affair, marked by the constant, aggressive presence of Allied aircraft everywhere, from the coast of France to the borders of Czechoslovakia. This freedom of movement in the air guaranteed that every strategic bombing mission that followed, and every tactical ground support mission during the invasion, would succeed with manageable losses. The air battle that guaranteed America's air supremacy was not a single legendary dogfight, but a 7-day campaign of unparalleled logistical effort and human endurance, fought by the B-17 crews who refused to turn back, and the P-51 pilots who hunted their prey until the German skies were silent. The gamble paid off, securing the most vital element necessary for ultimate victory in Europe: mastery of the high frontier. The foundation of victory in 1945 was laid in the freezing February skies of 1944.